What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another podcast episode. If you're watching this on YouTube or on Spotify, where you can, view the podcast video, you see that we're yet in a new location. I always switch locations. I've never done the same location twice. I also got for today a glass of very cold water because it is insanely hot, and I would just be sweating and dying here if I didn't have this water. So if I take a sip, here and there, excuse that. But it is crazy hot, so that's why that's a necessity today. But today what I wanted to talk about is what makes a good year for music, a good year for hip-hop, because we always talk about this, and especially also going into discussions with y'all guys talking about, 2016 was the best year in hip-hop. It's always something that comes up, and we connect different things and associate different albums and artists, and especially also times in our own personal lives with certain years in hip-hop and what was connected to that, what was going on in hip-hop at that current state. And I feel like when you talk to people, it's always the past that is better than the present, and that is something that, of course, is something that you see people saying their entire lives. The past was always the great thing, and the present is like, everything is bad. That is a very natural thing for humans to say, and of course it also translates and transmutes over into their perception of the music and the music they listen to in their lives. When you have a very notable event or a very great time in your life, maybe high school, maybe college, whatever, and you connect certain albums or music to that, then of course you're going to say, that was a great year for music. But aside from this very subjective view of things, there's a couple of more elements that we can break down and see why people would say certain stuff, and also connect this to what hip-hop is in 2022, because that is obviously very interesting to look at what the present state of things is as well. So let's start with the basics. So this entire concept of saying that 2016 was the best year for hip-hop, or 2022 was not a good year for hip-hop so far, it kind of suggests and insinuates that we break down these albums into years. It suggests that, an artist releases an album that year and we connect that year to the album. But in reality, that artist was likely not even working on that album in that year, but the years prior to that. And that is something that I think is very important discussing this, because the music that you listen to that year was made before that year. But we just know about the music because it was put out that, in the same time, or in that year. But for it to be a great year for hip hop, I believe the music would have to be created in that year, which is definitely not the case. When you, for example, talk about Kendrick Lamar, Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers, we're saying that 2022, that was the best album this year so far, or whatever we call it. But in reality, that was created in the span of 2017 to 2022, and that was probably the best time for Kendrick in between there. So there's always something that we got to distinguish and definitely draw a great line as to how subjective our view on this really is. But of course, there's a couple of more things we can dive into. A lot of people say, for example, I see this quite often, 2016 was the best year for hip-hop, because we had, for example, the Drake Meek Mill beef that summer, which definitely defined a whole generation, and the year prior Drake dropped If You're Reading This Is Too Late. 2016 also, a bunch of these Atlanta artists coming up, a bunch of the modern trap sound that we know really started bubbling up and spreading into the mainstream. The Migos were really popping off during that time too. We had people like Lil Uzi coming onto the scene, and so that year a lot of people see as, kind of the switch of the old era of hip-hop, of the Drake era that Drake was taking over, and also introducing new artists. Maybe that's what they like. Maybe that's what made it so special for them. But then moving forward, I think a lot of people have said, about the years after that, after 2016, less and less that those were great years for hip-hop. When you think of 2017, you're not that was a great year for hip-hop. 2018 might have been, 2019 was not too bad. A lot of people also say 2020. So when you break it down, it's for every year, we can find albums that were great. We can find albums that were, I don't want to say genre defining because that is a very, very loaded term to use, but I want to say that were very impactful to the way that we, consume hip hop and the way that we connect with these artists and stuff like that. So that is one thing that is very important to point out. Also how you what makes a great year for hip hop. It's kind of what I just said. Subjective taste, obviously, but also how it has impacted the genre in general. And so when you kind of break it down over the past year, for example, last year, 2021, I don't see a lot of people saying that it was a good year. The first half of the year, up until like May, June, July, a lot of people are saying like this was a weak year so far. But then you look at like J. Cole, the Off-Season, released in May. You look at Tyler, the Creator, Call Me If You Get Lost, released in June. We had Migos released in June, Polo G, all these big names that we have. We had Drake released in September. We had Kanye released in August, Donda, CLB. Big albums, very big albums. So I don't think that there's any denying that 2021 was objectively a pretty good year for hip hop. But maybe, you looking at it through your own lens, maybe you're like, okay, but I have not, taken enough time with these songs yet to have them define my life to be like, oh, that was a great year. And so I think that subjective part is very, very important when talking about this. And so 2022 already so far, I mean, we had big releases. As I said, Kendrick, first and foremost. Drake with the Honest and Nevermind record. We had Beyonce as well, and a bunch of these smaller artists. Vince Staples dropped an amazing record back in April. We had a Pusha T record, stuff like that. That's like the small things that add up. It's not always the big albums. Sometimes it's really those smaller artists that are not like full commercial mainstream, but that are definitely there in the scope of hip hop and in the hip hop world, and people know them. I'm giving Vince Staples as a suggestion. He also dropped a great self-titled EP last summer, 2021, that for me defined that summer as well in a way. Definitely made the summer a whole lot better. And so when you really break it down, I believe those smaller artists that are on the brink of like, they are known in hip hop, but they are not commercially super successful in mainstream, those are the artists that make or break the year. Because when you look at last year, a lot of people saying 2021 wasn't that great for hip hop. But then look at the albums that released. We got Drake, Kanye, J. Cole, Tyler, all those artists that released that year, and we're still like, okay, it wasn't that good. And so that's why I want to kind of stress that your subjective opinion on stuff definitely plays a very big role in how you perceive the year and how you judge if an album is actually a good year, if a year is actually a good year for hip hop or not, and what albums defined that year. But let's also get a little bit more into this year. As I just said, we had some big releases. We also had some smaller releases. We're seeing whole new genres coming up. We're seeing, these underground, more rage artists breaking into the mainstream, Yeat coming up. So I think for a lot of people that are into that sound, those projects, will definitely define their year. Those small projects getting more recognition, getting more fame, getting more mainstream appeal than they did before. Ken Carson dropped a album recently. So stuff like that is like those albums break into the mainstream. I think for a lot of people that are into that sound and are now getting into hip hop like that, they'll be very defining for their years to come in hip hop. And when you look at the years still to come, we got great albums coming out like Utopia. And I want to take Utopia as an example for this, because that is an album that a lot of people are very excited for. Utopia is like one of the biggest albums in hip hop that people have been anticipating, that people have been wanting to come out. And if that album drops, then I think it could define the year for a lot of people. And when you think back to 2022, you'd be like, oh, the year Utopia dropped. It's kind of like that for 2018 with Astroworld 2. We can't deny that. That summer was also dominated by like Astroworld. I mean, Drake dropped before that with God's Plan. How was the album called? That whack ass, oh yeah, Scorpion. So for a lot of people, that was also very summer defining. And maybe for this year, it'll also be Utopia. And that's another thing that I kind of just realized. We always see the summer as like the big thing that defines a year. When you think back to the best years in hip hop, isn't it always the summer that stands out as like, okay, but those albums dropped during the summer. And I know that is very likely because most people listen to albums in the summer more because they're out, they're like partying, they're doing all this. They're not just in their house, it's like cold, they only go out when they have to. So the summer is like when people are actually enjoying the music a little bit more. Of course, there are albums that are very, very nice to listen to in the winter. Like After Hours, The Weeknd. I wouldn't listen to that in the summer. Very, very melancholic album that I wouldn't listen to when it's like hot out and just partying and stuff like that. But I think the summer is what defines a year. And so also looking at this year, the summer's about to be over. It's the middle of August. So we gotta have some more artists drop for people to be like, okay, this is actually defining. I mean, this summer, what did we get? We got Beyonce, we got Kendrick, we had a couple of smaller artists here and there. Lil Baby still got a drop. We know that Trippie Redd still got a drop. As I said, Utopia. So those albums will play a very big role in how people will perceive this summer of 2022 and how that will go down in the history books of whether it was a good or a bad year in hip hop. So that's my thoughts on this. I don't know if you agree with any of the stuff that I said. If you do, then definitely let me know in the comments on YouTube or in the like little Q&A boxes that I put under my Spotify podcasts, or DM me on Instagram, on Twitter, on the Discord. If you're not part of the Discord yet, make sure you join the Benz Music official Discord server, best hip hop community in the world. I definitely want to start a discussion with y'all on topics like this. So I've had amazing discussions in the Discord. For example, Ray, I'm talking to you. He always hits me up on any like topic that I got on the podcast and wants to have a longer discussion on that. And I love that. That is exactly what these podcasts are for. That is what I want to do with this medium. Just like sit down, and I don't even have all my thoughts collected when I start talking about it. I have a couple of key points, and then just start a discussion with y'all guys. So it's very important for y'all to give y'all opinion on this too. So that's it from me. As I always say, if you're watching this on your favorite podcast platform, don't forget to follow me so you'll be notified when the new episode drops. Don't forget to rate me on Spotify if you enjoy the podcast. And subscribe to the YouTube channel if you haven't yet, but I think most of y'all are. And I'll catch you in the next one.